Hi everyone, so this video is going to be focusing on still life setup and the palette setup for starting with the neutrals for that still life and then the first possibly into the second pass of the painting. I am shooting this kind of later in the afternoon, so as I'm painting, the lighting might change a little bit as the sun goes down. That means that the shadows will get a bit darker, and you might see that in the time lapse. Again, I might even put the time lapse into two different chunks just to not make any video too long. The other thing is that this is going to be geared towards the advanced asynchronous painting class, but I'm going to interject and talk about where the intermediate and face-to-face classes can use this tutorial because we really haven't met face-to-face yet. And I don't want you to feel like you have to delay in thinking about your still life or getting started. Now remember, if I'm meeting with you in person, I will be setting up these situations for you, but it might be something that you, again, want to think about, or you might be working in tandem at home, and so you want to get a setup going. Some of you are also traveling, so this is a way that you can get started without having to be in the class as well. Again, so I will adjust the tutorial here and there, or just mention how you can make it either a more advanced situation or a more intermediate situation, depending on the level that you feel you're at. So to give you an idea, kind of a table of contents, it's going to start with the still life and what that looks like, the setup, just my key points there. I'm going to move to the palette and then my canvas, what size I'm using and how I treated my ground. And then there'll be a time lapse where I will go through either a time, like I'll kind of start slower and then time lapse, kind of see me build up the first and second layers. Again, today, depending on time. A lot of times too, if I feel like I need to interject with more time lapse and more painting, I will go ahead and film that as I go and then add that to the YouTube channel. Okay, so that's all for now. I will also say goodbye at the end and let's get painting. So first off, let me talk about the things that I collect for still life setup. I have here, I usually collect kind of odd drapery, and here is some packaging or packing materials because that can help bring elevation or different levels to the still life. Foam pieces, again, a lot of these things come in just packages that you get in the mail. The odd collective, something that it gets overlooked if you're doing at-home still life, just on occasion, is the clamp lamp situation. You can get those at the hardware store, and it's good if you start setting up your situations at home or you're doing still life, you know, for skill sets, skill building. This is something that you kind of do a little bit more often. I would have a whole series of these, and also in general in a studio, these are just handy to have. They offer extra light. It's kind of one of those things that artists just have the habit of collecting. I kind of see a clamp lamp, I grab it, and I have probably more than I know what to do with, but it's just one of those things that kind of feels like essential. Here, I actually, as you can see, earth tone still life objects. So I kind of keep an odd set of fake flowers, maybe mugs that I'm not using, mason jars. I kind of look for things that either I used as decor and I wasn't interested anymore, or they have an interesting shape or texture. For example, like an old paintbrush, but it fell apart, but I kept the wood handle because it has kind of this antique look to it, old paintbrushes. And sometimes too, different things can make you think of a narrative. So this gives me this very kind of classic, maybe Spanish still life look with the skull and then the old paintbrush, something like that, okay? So I tend to look for objects that I find interesting, look for variance in texture, and then I collect them and I keep a little bin for that. Also this shiny teapot, which I will be putting in the still life as well. Okay, so I am going to stop this video for now. I'm going to go ahead and set up the still life and walk through the decisions that I made there. Okay, so this is what I came up with. Underneath is that box that you saw. Loosely put the drape on top. I really love this one because it just adds some fun dynamic elements real quick. I like that it's not a plain drapery because the directional line is nice. Here, just kind of building up. Now, the customary to do odd number of objects. That's really better for the golden ratio, and that's better for the rule of thirds. So you can see there's a lot of nice angles here, a diagonal coming up to the top, kind of a tower moment there, and then a combination of shiny and textured objects. The drapery itself is kind of matte. These fake flowers are a bit matte, and then also there's kind of this shininess of the metal teapot, but just contrast with the leaves, the mug being ceramic and with a little bit of shine, but different surface. So you can show variance if you'd like. The other thing is I've kept it very neutral, which gives me room to accentuate colors or exaggerate if I would like to. And that's something I can figure out. I can think about my palette and say, am I going to be complementary? And maybe, as you can see with that mug, I could make it very green or earth heavy and then turn that even rustier or redder than it actually is. That's something that I can do. Do I want to keep it very neutral and brown and then again accentuate the blue? So a bit of a blue contrast, bring that up a little bit more. What about the yellow in the flower here? Maybe that could be brighter than it actually is, and I can add some accents. So I'm keeping it subtle, very much like the Mirandy example, and some of the other examples that were in that slide lecture, that Edwin Dickinson, keeping it very neutral so that gives me somewhere to go. Okay, so I'm not battling against bright color that already exists. Again, you see in the shadows are really nice because you can play with those. I can turn those more reddish, you see right there by the pot, or I can turn it bluish, purple, whatever it is I want to accentuate. As I'm going through the still life, I'm going to talk about that a little bit more towards the end when we're doing color correction. But for now, we're really going to start with a neutral base. Okay, so here I'm going to talk about the palette setup and what I'm going to use for that first and second pass. Just basically, again, creating subtle colors, limited palette, and that's what's going to get me the base for what other color accents I'm going to do in this still life. So again, the keywords here are neutrals, limited palette. So what I have is ultramarine. This is actually French ultramarine, but regular ultramarine will do. Cadmium yellow hue, you can go for the big stuff too, but a lot of times I just kind of go on a budget. This is ivory black, and this is titanium white. I also have raw umber. Burnt sienna can be here as well if you want a little bit more red in those undertones, but I'm gonna kind of go probably bluish. So I'm keeping it, this raw umber is much more neutral than burnt sienna is, so I'm going to keep it there. I also have to the side a little jar of linseed oil. I've got that set up for me, and then my solvent-free gel, because as I'm painting, that's what's gonna help me keep my brushes from getting too gunky. Okay, in the next bit, I'm just going to lay out these colors and then show you, and I usually actually can pre-mix this before I even start working with the still life, but I'm gonna show you how I kind of set up those initial colors to get going. Let me explain what I did here, which is kind of a color run of sorts, or I call it color strings. I do this with every single medium that I work with. So that would be from oil paint to acrylic paint to watercolor to digital. What I'm doing is just running out there, I'm making that palette or just a variation of the base colors so that I have something to work with when I get started. I can do this without even looking at the still life or the subject matter. I can basically, not painting with direct observation when I'm doing it. So I can take a glance at my subject and then set up this color situation before I get started. So that being said, this is something you may or may not already do this, but this is something that I highly recommend, is that you learn to get yourself that base to get started, and then kind of as you're working, you kind of change these colors as you go, okay? So these mixtures will either get lighter or darker or add more blue or I'll add more yellow, so on and so forth. The logic here was very neutral, almost grayish looking base. I know there's some greens that I want to accent, and I said too with the flowers that I'm going to be looking at those yellows. So I was getting all of that ready to go. Now this is for oil paints. With acrylic paints, you want to be a little more sparing when you do this, but if you have a water bottle or a stay wet palette, you can do it, because again, you don't want to pre-mix too much, because the acrylic medium, or even watercolor for that matter, will dry kind of quickly. So you kind of mix as you go. With oil paints though, you have the luxury of them not drying in a session, and also being able to add linseed oil, kind of keeping them really moist. So you can pre-mix. I don't recommend pre-mixing too much though. You kind of want to get that base going and then get into the painting without too, you don't want to wait too long. You kind of want to start to get going, get some ideas on the canvas, because you're going to be adjusting as you go anyway. So that's what's happening here. So that's a little bit about the palette. I am going to, while I have the overhead, because I have to switch angles so much. I want to get as much as possible with the overhead. This is the brushes that I'm going to be using. I'm going to actually map out with the round on the canvas. For the first passes, I'm going to have a smaller canvas today, so these are smaller sizes that I'm using. So this is the round, kind of a beaten down filbert or bright. I'm not sure which. No, that's the bright. I think that's a beaten down filbert. That's an old one. And then, yeah, that's flat. This is the bright, I believe. So I'm going to keep these smaller ones for now, because my canvas is on the smaller side. I have a palette knife. You can see a very used one. And got my viewfinder ready to go so I can get my composition ready to go. And then I'm actually going to use, I'm going to hold it out a little bit here, but I'm going to use a mid to a light toned gray canvas. So again, I need to change the angle and basically put the camera behind me in the canvas as I paint, and you can see the still life. So from there, I'll talk a little bit about the setup, and I won't be back in the overhead for a bit, or at least for this session. So if you really want that overhead angle, you're gonna have to kind of keep, I'll take a screenshot of that as well, thinking to myself. But this basically is the mixing overhead moment. And again, I'll move to, you can see basically the canvas and the still life. I have a lighting situation in here with the ring light for the video, the light for the still life, and then my overhead. So I'm gonna kind of negotiate all three of those just to see what kind of angles I can get on the still life, just so you can see in the video the lighting situation. I might be fiddling with that for a bit, but hopefully it will come through. The main thing for me is that you see my canvas and what I'm working on there, and that will be the goal. Okay, to the canvas. So as you can see, my setup is ready to go. I have the table easel here. I have my canvas with the medium ground. The still life is behind, and from this angle, I'm gonna zoom in a bit with the time lapse, but from this angle, you should be able to see the still life as well as my painting in progress. I have my viewfinder, so I can check my composition, and as you can see, the paints are laid out below. I'm right-handed, so I'm gonna be wheeling my table over with my brushes to here, so I can go, I like to go down to the paint, up to the canvas, and across. So in this time lapse, you'll get about the first pass, and then maybe a little bit into the second, some adjustments, and that will be about it for this tutorial. I will have another tutorial where I'll do the color adjusting. Again, I will kind of chime in before it's all said and done. If it's a little too dark today, well, actually, no, I'll just chime in and say bye for this video. Again, as always, well, let me get started, but then at the end, I will remind you that you can always comment on the video, and feel free to ask questions and I can answer there on YouTube. Okay, let's get started. Okay, so I'm just gonna chime in for a second. There was a bit of a clamp lamp calamity. And I also wanted to kind of show you what's going on because you might be wondering, what is she doing and how is she approaching this in the time lapse? Well, what I'm doing is just staying, again, very neutral using that raw umber and white. Pickles is talking about it in the background as well. And then I am grouping. So I have a toned canvas. So I basically haven't even done the light areas yet. And those are really gonna pop against that tone. If you're working from white, then you're probably going to add those mids in. You can always feel free to add a little bit of color to your gesso, and this gives you a nice base. And as you can see, I'm working reductively a little bit, leaving out those lighter areas as I group those midtones. I did go ahead and put some darks in the back. There's, as you can see, there's a variable background, but sometimes I go for darker contrast just because I know in the end, that's gonna be something that I'm gonna really like for this composition. Other than that, I'm gonna move some of the little greens in the foliage down into here. Again, kind of continue on mapping out not necessarily the lightest lights, but just like those mids to mid light, and then some of the darks, and that's gonna kind of wrap up this pass of the painting. And then again, like I said, I will come back with the, you know, more passes and then the details as well. Okay, so back to painting. Okay, so that's going to conclude the first pass. As you can see, I just kind of, one of the reasons that I'm going to stop with this for today is because I'm going to have to add some reds and some warm colors to kind of continue to fine tune what I call the second pass. Again, everything is really close and very neutral in this particular painting. And I've done that on purpose because I want things to go from similarity to difference. You might have painted like this before, or it might be something new. As you can see, I'm not worried about local color at all. I'm not even paying attention to it. It's almost like I'm doing a tone, like charcoal, and adding some color to charcoal. So I'm almost working kind of black and white. So for the second pass, I'm going to be adding some more colors to the palette so that I can expand the push and pull. For example, the stripes in the front, they're gonna need some red so that they can contrast some of the cool tones in the back. So yeah, so about a first pass, let's say 30 minutes to an hour, and you kind of get to this point where you can get all the objects in your entire composition on the canvas and then get ready to start to change, you know, think more about local color. One other thing you can see that I changed my composition from beginning, I kind of flipped it to portrait because I did notice that that would probably fit better on my canvas in the end. Scaling and size, I kind of adjust as I go. I make sure that I get the general proportions and then really adjust as I'm painting. It's all about layering. So it's not like a colored in or paint by number. It's not a filled in drawing. It's really a layering process. And that's what I'm doing here. Okay, so that is all for now, and until next time, we get this, the next video again will be the second pass. It will be coming to you soon, and we'll again expand the palette a little bit and get into greater specificity and detail.